Mr. Vice President, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be back.
Your running mate, President Trump, announced his third bid for the White House this week. Your response in many interviews has been, you expect there to be better choices in 2024. Are you saying that because you think he's unfit, or do you think there's Trump fatigue?
Well, Chuck, let me say, I don't think anyone could have defeated Hillary Clinton except Donald Trump in 2016.
I've heard you say that. Why is that?
Well, I think Republican primary voters knew how formidable an opponent Hillary Clinton would be, the decades-long political machine around the Clinton family. And they knew we needed a standard bearer who would be a fighter, who would literally take the fight to the public debate in the campaign. And I also think that after 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration, that Republican voters knew that we needed someone who could bring real transformational change to rebuild our military, revive our economy, appoint conservatives to our courts at every level, confront the international challenges that we face. And I think that Donald Trump was fitted to the times. And, you know, I learned that along the way. As I write in my book, So Help Me God, I endorsed another candidate in the primary 2016 in Indiana. And in all fairness, the candidate I endorsed won all 3 counties I campaigned with him in. But Donald Trump won all the rest. Okay. And I saw in that the connection that he made to voters. And I never doubted he was going to win the election. But, you know, I think after I think one of the most consequential presidencies in my lifetime, of which I was honored to be a part, I truly do believe that the American people are looking to get back to the policies of the Trump-Pence administration. But I think they're looking for leadership that could unite our country around our highest ideals and also bring a renewed commitment to civility and the mutual respect that the American people show to one another every day.
The former president has said it's disloyal for some in the Republican Party to challenge him, and he's speaking about not just you, but Governor DeSantis, Secretary Pompeo. Do you accept the idea that running against him is disloyal?
I think the American people love competition. My loyalty is to my faith, to my values, and to America. And I think it is, if we're a part of that debate next year, and our family will sort that out before the end of the year, Chuck,
right.
Or if we're just chipping in from the sidelines and others are in that contest, I think a good, healthy debate over the direction of the country is warranted. I mean, since the first days of the Biden-Harris administration, it's almost seemed as though we have a new Democrat administration intent on weakening America at home and abroad, whether it's the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether it be the gusher of spending that ignited the worst inflation in 40 years, the war on energy that's caused gasoline prices to go through the roof, a crime wave in our major cities. And of course, after undoing all the successful policies that secured our southern border, we now have the worst crisis on our southern border in American history. And so I truly do believe Republican primary voters want to hear a strong debate. They'll want to find our best standard bearer so that having won back the House, that became official this last week, we'll have a chance to win back America in 2024.
You laid out a reason why you think the Biden administration has led America down a path that you don't like. Why do you think voters didn't accept that premise in 2022? They clearly didn't in the battleground states. Why do you think that was? Well,
they did in many states around the country. It's in the state of New York, 4 new Republican congressmen elected, may well be the margin of the majority itself. In the state of Iowa, for the first time in a half a century, they'll have all Republican members of the House of Representatives. But Chuck, I take your point. I mean, a win is a win. I'm glad to see Kevin McCarthy will accept the gavel to be the next Speaker of the House. But I'd like to see more Republicans elected, and I'd like to see Republicans win the Senate and more governorships around the country. But for me, the common denominator had to do with whether or not candidates were focused on the future. As I traveled around the country...
It sounds like that's code for whether or not candidates were sort of in the Trump spell.
Well,
I mean, I think you're trying to be polite. I understand that. But it does seem as what you're saying is anybody that was close to Trump didn't do well.
But I think it's broader than that, Chuck. For me, as I traveled, and I went to 35 states in the last year and a half, campaigning for all kinds of men and women, running for statewide office and for the House and the Senate. And as I sort through the results, there really is a common denominator. Candidates that were focused on the issues that people are facing today and solutions for tomorrow, focused on the future, did quite well. But candidates that were focused on the past, candidates that were focused on relitigating the 2020 election did not fare as well. And we had some surprising and disappointing results. And so I think, as I said when I was campaigning for Governor Brian Kemp in a primary that he won decisively, it was in many ways divided along this very question last spring. I said that if Georgia voters voted strongly to renominate Governor Brian Kemp, they could send a deafening message that the Republican Party is the party of the future. And they did that. And Governor Kemp went up against probably the most formidable Democrat candidate in the country and won a decisive re-election because, again, he stayed focused, as so many of our candidates did, on the challenges today and a focus on tomorrow.
Are you? What do you make of the fact that it's been, since we're talking, I think it's been 3 days since President Trump announced, and barely anybody has endorsed him. The party is not rallying around him. Why do you think that is?
I haven't really followed it, and so I can't speak to who's come alongside.
The endorsements are very tiny. The list.
I think what I'm saying is what I've been hearing over the last year and a half. Having returned to being a private citizen, that means I get to drive my own car. I go to the grocery store. I talk to people as I walk through airports who recognize me from my years of public service in Indiana and around the country. And the consistent message that I've heard is what I just shared. People want to get back to the successful policies of the Trump-Pence administration, but some of the most ardent Republicans in the country have pulled me aside and said, we need leadership that will unite the country around our values.
You stop short of saying that the former president is unfit to serve again, but his former Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, says he's unfit for office. Another former Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, says Trump has no moral compass. He doesn't know the difference between a truth and a lie. Bill Barr, the Attorney General, he has neither the temperament nor the persuasive powers. Judge Luddick, somebody you admire, I know. Trump and his apologists are a clear and present danger to American democracy. Is he fit to serve as President of the United States for another 4 years?
I really do believe that's a decision for the American people. And President Trump has now
Isn't your
announced his
opinion?
intention
Don't you think
to
your
seek
opinion
re-election.
matters to the American
Well,
people? And how about this? The fact that you may run, are you sending that message without saying it?
Well, I'll keep you posted on whether I'm going to run or not. But I do think we'll have better choices. But what I won't do is I won't join those that want to dismiss the 4 years of our administration and all that we accomplished for the American people. That, as I write in So Help Me God, the president's leadership was central to our success in everything that was accomplished, whether it be rebuilding our military or decisions he made as commander-in-chief to allow our armed forces to crush the ISIS caliphate and take out their leader, to allow our armed forces to take out Qasem Soleimani, a man responsible for the death of hundreds of American service members during the war in Iraq. And it was the president's vision to cut taxes and roll back regulation and his direct engagement on Capitol Hill with members of Congress that saw us pass the tax cuts and reforms that saw 7 million jobs created, unemployment at a 50-year low. And so the policies that, and energy and securing our border and 3 Supreme Court justices are all a great source of pride to me. And in my book, So Help Me God, I try and make sure and give the president his due. I was proud to be his vice president and advance those policies that worked for the American people against an avalanche of opposition by the Democratic Party from day one, and frankly by many in the national media who were preoccupied with controversies and conspiracies and the Russia, Russia, Russia message that dominated for 2.5 years. And so I want to give the president his due
You're making an ends justifies the means argument, and is there? I mean, that's Wind doesn't. Okay.
No, what I've said is I don't want to dismiss. Is many people that want to draw broad conclusions about the president or anyone else in the public sphere want to dismiss the balance of the record. In my book, I try and make sure and present it. But also, Chuck, I think I'm very clear in saying that the administration did not end well, that I took a strong stand.
Did Donald Trump damage the public? Let me ask you this.
That had to be in public because every other time the president and I differed, as vice president, I thought it was important that I kept those things in private.
Did Donald Trump damage the Republican Party?
When it came down to the peaceful transfer of power and doing my duty under the Constitution of the United States, we had the tragic day of January 6th and its aftermath. And all of that in totality is the president's record and the record the American people will decide upon.
Look, you want the public to try to split this. Are you concerned that Donald Trump's behavior post-election 2020 damaged the Republican Party, and is the 2022 midterm sort of evidence?
Well, I think it really does depend on our candidates and whether or not Republican candidates around the country will learn the lessons that we learned through that tragic day. And frankly, in many of the elections that took place in the midterms. I'll never forget, I write about it in the book. It was the night before January 6th. The president and I were alone in the Oval Office in what was ultimately a tense conversation. I had made my position clear for weeks to him that as vice president, I believed I did not have the authority to return or reject electoral votes when the House convened to count the electoral votes for president and vice president. But there was great tension in the room, but at the outset, I remember the president looking at me, and he pointed out the window at the crowd that was gathering just off the South Lawn and in the ellipse. And he said, "Did you see that crowd out there?" And I said, "I did, Mr. President." And he said, "Those people love us." And I said, "Those people love you." And he said, "Well, that's probably true." And then I looked at him very seriously and I said, "And those people love the Constitution, Mr. President." You know, you and I have known each other a long time, Chuck. I first ran for Congress when Ronald Reagan was in the White House. It would take me 12 years to get there. That all along the way, I was a constitutional conservative. I fought for the conservative agenda in the House. I led as a conservative governor in Indiana. And I was part, I believe, of one of the most accomplished conservative administrations in American history in the Trump-Pence administration. But all along the way, I've always believed that our movement is ultimately grounded in a love for the Constitution and in the principles of the American founding. And that was the point that I made to the president. And I believe it still is. I believe Republican voters and the Republican Party's future is ultimately grounded in us producing men and women who will stand up for the ideals enshrined in the Constitution and the Declaration, ideals Ronald Reagan stood for without apology, and that'll carry our movement forward for generations.
Does his behavior in January of 2021 tell you that he doesn't respect the Constitution?
Well, all I know is that what the president asked me to do, I would have violated my oath to the Constitution.
So that's not respecting the Constitution. He certainly didn't respect it enough to ask you to be disloyal to your oath.
The President of the United States in that moment was receiving counsel from attorneys who were telling him, as the Bible says, what his itching ears wanted to hear. He had, beginning in mid-November, dismissed some of the extraordinary and capable attorneys that were serving in the White House and serving in the campaign, and replaced them with a gaggle of lawyers who brought in conspiracy theories and made promises that they never kept. I write in the book about how it would be a year after that tragic day that one of those lawyers, Sidney Powell, actually said in a court filing that no reasonable person would have assumed that what we were saying was factual. Now she tells us that the president was receiving terrible advice from people who not only shouldn't have been in the Oval Office, they shouldn't have been let on the White House grounds.
You made that point a couple of times. You praised John Kelly for how he managed that Oval Office and managed who came in out of it. How much of what happened on January 6th is on the hands of Mark Meadows?
The president's got to rely on his senior team. The term gatekeeper sounds offensive to the American mind. You think of open government and access, but what General John Kelly did when he became White House Chief of Staff, and what frankly all the best White House Chiefs of Staff have done throughout history, is make sure that the only people that get into the Oval Office are people that have the credibility to be there. And make sure that the president understands what they're coming to talk about, so he's in a position to be able to make the decisions that only a president can make. General Kelly created that order, and sadly when he left, Mick Mulvaney, I think, did his level best as an interim chief of staff to bring that about. But I was disappointed in Mark Meadows' performance as chief of staff, particularly at the end. But from very early on, when it was clear that he had talked the president out of White House coronavirus press briefings, and in a very real sense, I think his tenure as chief of staff did not serve the president well.
It sounds like it's not just on January 6th. Are you saying that a lot of the COVID misinformation that sometimes came out of President Trump's mouth was due to Mark Meadows' lack of gatekeeping?
Well, let's talk about COVID. I have some great
No, I do want to talk about that,
so
and I plan on it, but I want to ask you about Meadows specifically. Was he a bad gatekeeper then, too?
Well, I've always believed that in a public health emergency, more is more when it comes to information.
Okay.
It was why immediately after I was tapped to lead the White House Coronavirus Task Force, within a matter of days we began to brief you and other members of the media about what our team was developing and the way we were standing up our national response. We very quickly began press briefings on a daily basis, and I think they served the country well. But once we went through that early difficult period with COVID, and the new chief of staff started his tenure, the pressure began a month or so into the pandemic to move away from the briefings. I objected to that, but obviously it was the president's decision. But I think ultimately, when you're going through such an uncertain and challenging times, giving the public the most information possible, those of you that are in the information business,
right.
the most possible is better served.
You imply it in your book that meeting with the lawyers, when you had the campaign lawyers, and then on the speakerphone is Rudy Giuliani and some of these other lawyers, you concluded that in some ways they helped foment the insurrection on January 6th, that was the moment that you seem to go that they went down the wrong road. Is that how you intended it to be read?
Well, the way I wrote it in So Help Me God was that while there is understandable focus on the days leading up to January 6th, for me the fuse was lit in mid-November.
In that phone call by Rudy Giuliani?
No, the Oval Office was filled with advisors. The president's campaign advisors were there. The other senior members of the staff. On the speakerphone were the new lawyers that were vying for the opportunity to lead the election challenges. Justin Clark, who is an extraordinary attorney and a man of great integrity, was telling the president about the dozens of lawsuits that have been filed challenging election results around the country, and he was painting something of a pessimistic view about the prospects of those. But the campaign had every right to file those lawsuits, and that's the process that we have. States conduct elections, and if there are questions about irregularities or fraud, they're to be brought into the courts that can review the evidence and the law. But they were painting a picture to the president that things were likely not going to be successful. But when Rudy Giuliani said over the speakerphone, that your lawyers are not telling you the truth, Mr. President. Things got very heated.
Mm-hmm. And that's when you think the fuse got lit, that ultimately probably led to January 6th.
You know, the Oval Office is a place that was always, when President Trump was in office, it was a
You never knew who you were going to
place.
run into. I had experienced that myself. You never knew who you were going to run into.
But it was always dynamic. He welcomed vigorous debate. It was part of his decision-making process, and he made many good and great decisions that I'll be proud of the rest of my life for having been there for it, who witnessed. But in that moment, it was a new low.
Do you think the president
there was
committed?
shouting, there was yelling, but in the aftermath of that meeting, the president made the decision to replace his capable campaign lawyers with this widening circle of outside attorneys who ultimately led him to the conclusion that I had the authority to overturn the election, which was demonstrably and historically false.
Do you think the president committed a criminal act in fomenting the insurrection? Do you think a crime was committed?
Well, I don't know if it is criminal to listen to bad advice from lawyers. Truth is, what the president was repeating is what he was hearing from that gaggle of attorneys around him. And, you know, presidents, just as like all of us that have served in public life, you have to rely on your team. You have to rely on the credibility of the people around you. And so, you know, as time goes on, I hope we can move beyond this, beyond that prospect. And this is really a time when our country ought to be healing. And frankly, the Justice Department's actions have been exposed from during our administration, where FBI agents were advancing political agendas, falsifying records, using what came to be found out to be opposition research paid for by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party, the so-called dossier. And then this past summer, when we see the Justice Department execute a search warrant against the personal residence of a former president of the United States, I think the American people, join me in hoping we can move past this contention.
But is he above the law? I mean, if he violated the law, should he be held to the same standard that I would be held to?
Chuck, no one's above the law. But I would hope the Justice Department would give careful consideration before they take any additional steps in this matter.
Whether it's about January 6th or about the classified documents?
Well, again, on the classified documents, let me say, and as you can tell from my book, I've not hesitated to criticize the president when I think he was wrong. And clearly possessing classified documents in an unprotected area is not proper. But I have to tell you, I was on the Judiciary Committee for 10 years in the House of Representatives. I know how the Justice Department works, and there had to be many other ways to resolve those issues.
Sounds
and
like they
collect
tried.
those classified documents.
They tried for a year.
They didn't try everything. And I have to tell you, going to the last resort of executing a search warrant against a former president of the United States, I think sent the wrong message. It was a divisive message in this country. But I think worse still, it was the wrong message to the wider world that looks to America as the gold standard. And
doesn't it send the message that nobody's above the law in this country, that our democracy is so strong? It can handle the idea that, if former presidents commit a crime,
but Chuck,
they don't get a pass.
But Chuck, you follow foreign affairs as close as anybody in your business. And it's much more commonplace in the third world that when one leader comes in, then they prosecute and jail the previous leader. America should never be associated with that image at all. And I truly do believe and hope that the Justice Department will give careful consideration to any further steps in that light.
You must have really not liked it when the president, when he was in office, how many times he wanted to weaponize the IRS? He wanted to order. You've seen these reports. Perhaps he didn't say it in front of you, but do you think the former president respects these institutions?
I'd let him answer that, but I never had reason to believe that he didn't respect men and women who serve in law enforcement at every level. In fact, everywhere we go around the country to this day, I have people in law enforcement thanking me for the support that we gave them. At a time when the Democratic Party was giving voice to the defund the police movement and assuming the worst every time a tragic incident happened in a police shooting, that they saw in our administration a reflexive willingness to support law enforcement, to seek the facts, find justice, make sure justice was served. But in all the time that I served in the Trump-Pence administration, I think it was very clear our administration stood with the men and women on the thin blue line, whether they were federal law enforcement or the rank and file serving on the streets of our cities.
Okay, but you did just hit the FBI pretty hard yourself in some accusations you made about politicization. How do you square the two?
Well, I think the men and women that serve in the FBI, the rank and file, are some of the best people in the United States. I put the blame for the decision to execute a search warrant at the personal residence of a former president of the United States on the leadership of the Justice Department. It's inconceivable to me that that wasn't a decision that was made at the very highest levels and approved at the highest levels.
Attorney General said so.
And
he came out. He owned it. He did own it.
That's right. And I think he should have thought better of it, Chuck. There were preliminary steps. I want to be very clear on this. If they had additional evidence that there were additional documents, they could have gone to court.
They did.
Specific
everything
production.
You're describing, they did before. They didn't want to do it the way they ended up doing it.
Trust me, they didn't do everything they could have done and avoided this incredibly divisive step that sent the wrong message to the country and the wrong message to the world. If anything, I want to see the Justice Department, and I think a new Republican majority is going to be a part of this. I want to see the credibility of the Justice Department restored after years of politicization during the Trump-Pence administration. I mean, what went on during the time of Jim Comey's tenure in the 2016 campaign, the early days of our administration, the conduct of the FBI with regard to the Russia collusion hoax. On and on it went. And as someone who cherishes the men and women who serve in the Justice Department, and especially the FBI, I think now is a time for them to be focusing on restoring public confidence in our institutions.
You don't have confidence in Merrick Garland as Attorney General, Judge Garland?
I have great difficulty with the decision that he made. I have great concerns about his judgment and leadership at the Justice Department in the wake of it.
I want to read something from your book, because you brought up Russia a few times. And you wrote this about the collusion crowd, you called it. They never gave any thought to the anxiety they were causing the American people, the damage they were doing to our institutions and the credibility of our elections. The collusion crowd had no regard for the environment they were creating, one in which hyper-partisans could look at dishonest attempt to overturn an election and wonder why they couldn't do the same thing. Everything you said there could apply to Republicans who denied the 2020 election results.
Yeah, but you're comparing 4 weeks of rhetoric with 4 years by leaders in the Democratic Party. I mean, Hillary Clinton said that the election was stolen.
She also conceded the day after the election. The day after the election.
Right. So she
Donald Trump has still not conceded.
She conceded, and then she spent 2.5 years saying the election was stolen. She said that Donald Trump was not a legitimate president over and over. It wasn't just her. It was Democrat leaders in the Congress of the United States actually said over and over.
But I'm going to go back to something. 2 wrongs make a right. Let's accept that premise.
But what I wrote in So Help Me God is that
you're basically saying this happened on this January 6th stuff happened because the Democrats questioned the 2016 election.
Chuck, I think I've been very clear. people who rioted on the Capitol of January 6th need to be held to the strictest account of the law. But I just don't want to ignore the fact that for 4 years, their standard bearer in 2016, many of the leaders in their own party, were not only questioning the legitimacy of our administration, suggesting that our campaign had colluded with a foreign power to win the election, facilitated 2.5 years of reckless accusations about that culminated in nothing, in a conclusion by the Justice Department that there was no collusion, no obstruction, case closed.
There wasn't a lot of cooperation by the Trump White House on that.
I thought there was incredible cooperation. We produced millions of pages of documents and provided testimony.
There's a whole half of the Mueller report is about obstruction and about the lack of cooperation and the attempts to prevent information from being.
Look,
I don't think any of us want to relitigate the Mueller report.
No, I don't want to relitigate it, but I strongly agree with the conclusions that were made. But the most important thing was there was no collusion at all. No, 2.5 years and millions of dollars.
They didn't find that.
And
but
I see what the Democrats
how do you
are doing
square
for
this,
4
though?
years. Let me say this.
Go ahead.
I think for 4 years, from their standard bearer and Hillary Clinton forward, through 2.5 years of the Russia hoax, and then impeaching the president for a phone call, there was a relentless effort to overturn the 2016 election. And as I write in my book, all of that rhetoric, and frankly, many of your colleagues in the media who recklessly repeated accusations about Russia collusion and the fact that there was evidence of collusion that would never come, did that all never with a thought for what they were sowing into the body politic and what might be seized upon by some of the most extreme elements at the other end
but in
of
fairness,
the political spectrum. It's not to excuse anything.
Yeah.
It's just to say, I believe that we need to move into a new season in America where we not only practice civility and respect for one another, but that we respect the outcome of elections administered by states, certified by the Congress.
What do you make of what your good friend, Dan Coates, who was director of the National Intelligence during your administration, where he couldn't figure out President Trump's behavior when it came to Vladimir Putin, and told Bob Woodward he thought, well, maybe Putin does have something. I don't know. I can't explain it. Dan Coates is not a guy that just throws out conspiracy theories. You know this.
Well, it was always very clear to me two things. Number one, I never needed anyone's counsel about Vladimir Putin. In the debate in 2016, I called him a small and bullying leader in Russia. I know when one prior
running mate never did.
One prior Republican president said he looked him in the eyes, saw his soul. I like what John McCain said. I looked him in the eyes and I saw KGB.
Right.
And I hate that view. But President Trump took a different approach. Not just with Vladimir Putin, but frankly with every different potential adversary around the world. And that was essentially to bring them in through something of a charm offensive. But at the same time, to bring the hammer of American strength on the relationship to drive policy and outcomes. I mean, factually, our administration was tougher on Russia from very early on than any other predecessor in the 20th century.
Why do you think Putin ordered so many people to help the Trump-Pence ticket? Because while there was no proof of collusion, there was proof they interfered.
Now, Chuck, that I have to correct you on that, but you haven't had all the briefings I've had. What Russia did in the 2016 election, that I said on the record many times, is Russia meddled in the 2016 election on both sides. The Russian model is to sow propaganda on both sides, to sow division in countries. They've been doing it across Eastern Europe for many years. They've been doing it in Western countries. And they did it in the United States. not favoring one side or the other. As
Well, it seemed like they did favor one side in this case, the way they amplified.
That's not what the Mueller report found out. The Mueller report found that they sowed division on both sides.
They did a little bit on the during the Democratic primaries. I hear you there. But during the general, it was all about amplifying Trump.
Well, thanks for conceding that.
No, I understand in the primaries that was true. But this was an obsession of them to target Hillary Clinton, whether it was Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump.
When I met Vladimir Putin prior to our midterm elections in Singapore, he asked for a private moment to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't very private. He had a dozen people around him. I had a dozen people around me. But after he brought up issues like disarmament and an upcoming summit in Argentina, I said, President Putin, I have something I want to say to you. And he said, go ahead. And I said, we know what happened in 2016 and it can't happen again. He immediately feigned ignorance and turned to his Foreign Secretary Lavrov, speaking in Russia as though he didn't understand me. And then he nodded slowly and started to say in Russian that wasn't us. We didn't do anything about it. And I said, President Putin, I'm very aware of your public statements about this. But we know what happened. And it can't happen again. And the truth is, when it came to Russia, it was our administration that took on Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline that was making Europe more dependent. It was our administration that took out more than 100 Russian mercenary soldiers in Syria without one American casualty. It was our administration that stood strong against Russia by strengthening NATO, demanding that our NATO allies live up to their commitment to our common defense. So, to me, as you ask, understanding what President Trump's approach was to Russia, I honestly think it was a combination approach. It was one of the ways that he got Kim Jong-un in North Korea to stop testing nuclear weapons and firing missiles and actually come to the peace table. Maybe it was something that he learned in real estate.
Nothing's been resolved.
Maybe it was his real estate style. Be friendly and then be very, very tough. That was a model that resonated. We made great progress. And frankly, I think the lack of the credible threat of the use of force that we established in our administration with cruise missiles into Syria on 2 occasions, with taking out Qasem Soleimani and crushing the ISIS caliphate, is one of the reasons why the Trump-Pence administration is the only administration in the 21st century where Russia did not attempt to redraw international lines by force. They knew there would be consequences. They knew we meant business. And I think that was an approach that had great merit.
I want to move to a few things from your days as Vice President. On COVID, and we've talked a little bit about it. Does it trouble you how much Dr. Fauci was vilified during the pandemic response?
You know, I'll never forget the day that President Trump asked me to lead the White House Coronavirus Task Force in late February. He asked me if I'd be willing to do it. I'd been a governor. I understood the role of states in public health emergencies. We'd dealt with 2 public health emergencies when I was governor of Indiana, including the first case of MERS that appeared in the United States of America, a virus more contagious and more lethal many times over than COVID. I looked at the president, as I recounted, so help me God, and said, I'm here to serve. And I huddled with what had been the beginnings of the White House Coronavirus Task Force that included several health experts from the CDC, Dr. Fauci with the NIH and others. But immediately I knew it was important that we establish balance. I added the Secretary of the Treasury so that we would be able to reflect on developing advice for the President that would think about the wider impact on our economy. I brought in the Secretary of Agriculture as we talked about the impact on food supply in the country. We brought in people like Larry Kudlow, economic experts, that would really help the President have a balanced view of any decisions that we would make. It was always about saving American lives, but a president has to have the whole picture. And I must tell you, as I wrote in So Help Me God, I think in the early days of the Coronavirus Task Force, Dr. Fauci was a great source of comfort to millions of Americans. He had an easygoing bedside manner that he communicated at the podium. And as I said, we always had a good rapport in those days, because Dr. Fauci, in my time leading the task force, always stayed in his lane. He was always the first one to say, I'm the scientist at the table. I'm going to tell you what the scientific perspective is. But he would almost invariably say, I know the president and you have a lot more to consider than just that. You have to think of the broader impact on the American public and on the country as a whole. And so, for me in those early days, he made an enormous difference in the development of a very balanced policy, empowering states, igniting the entrepreneurial spirit of companies around the country to develop the supplies, the masks, to ultimately the medicines and the vaccines in record time. But I must tell you that when the Biden administration came in and essentially turned over the management of COVID to Dr. Fauci, I was not surprised to see them put all of their emphasis on vaccines. And then after having promised that they would not mandate vaccines, then seeking to mandate vaccines on Americans. That's still a mandate on healthcare workers and military personnel today. That was the doctor approach. And I think when President Biden came in and essentially empowered Dr. Fauci, I think the American people, I think they recoiled at that approach, and sadly, the Biden administration lost more Americans in their first year with COVID than we did in our first year, a year where we had none of the tools, few supplies, no testing, ultimately no medicines until the end.
Is it on them that people wouldn't take vaccines? I mean, this vaccine, you were very pro-vaccine. You made sure people saw you get the vaccine.
Right.
The reason we had all these deaths was people that wouldn't get vaccinated. It was a stew that was boiling around in some of these, internet conservative circles.
I know that's the, forgive me for saying, but that's the cliche in the national debate.
It's not a cliche.
It was all
it's
about
the numbers.
vaccines.
It was the counties.
But again, Chuck, with great respect, Chuck.
No, I understand, but
the
data is the data.
The Biden administration focused exclusively on vaccines. Our administration focused on empowering states to provide them with the supplies, countermeasures for nursing homes, making sure that we had therapeutics available and distributed. There should have been an Operation Warp Speed on therapeutics. The Biden administration literally stopped the development of testing and ran short of testing by the spring of their first year. There was no effort to develop life-saving therapeutics around the country.
You don't accept the idea that maybe both administrations struggled with testing? I mean,
Well, no, we didn't have COVID testing when I was tapped to lead the White House Corona Task Force. With the entrepreneurial
with testing.
innovation
We had to go to
of American
South Korea
research
for
companies,
tests.
we reinvented testing from a standing start. I mean, we had done 8,000 COVID tests at the end of February. But by June, because of American innovation, because of American companies that we turned to and empowered to develop those technologies, we literally were testing tens of millions of people a month. So that's why the title of the chapter of my book, So Help Me God, is Only in America. I mean, we're going to be debating these, and we should. We should debate our nation's response to COVID for many, many years and learn the lessons of it. But I want to make sure we always give credit to the healthcare workers, the first responders, the grocery store workers, all the incredible, innovative medical companies and research companies around this nation that saw us through those early dark days and have put the COVID pandemic in the past.
Still, the vilification of Dr. Fauci, was it you explained why it happened. Should it have happened? Was it fair? Is it fair what President Trump has said about him and what some critics of him? Do you think this stuff's been fair?
Well, this is a freedom-loving nation. And early on, we asked the American people to make sacrifices in those 15 days to slow the spread. so that what was happening in New York and New Jersey and New Orleans and Detroit and Seattle wouldn't be happening everywhere. That we wouldn't run out of supplies in our hospitals, that Americans wouldn't be denied hospital beds. And the American people shouldered that burden. But shutdowns were always just a temporary effort to essentially take a knee while we spun up the supplies and the resources to make sure that no American would ever be denied of the health care that you'd want any member of your family and mine to have. But the problem was, I believe that Dr. Fauci ultimately aligned himself with many Democrat governors who took what were temporary policies and made them long-term policies in their state. And the American people love freedom.
Is it wrong to, I mean, whatever you may think of the decision, you say American people love freedom, these Democratic governors, in their mind, they were just trying to save lives. Do you accept that?
Look, I never judge people's intentions, but I do judge their policies.
Okay.
And the truth is, we created a framework in those early days to ask for a pause in our economy so that we could make sure that our healthcare workers would not be lacking in the supplies and resources and masks and gowns that they would need to meet this moment, this unfurling pandemic, worst pandemic in 100 years. But I must tell you that one of the things I'm proudest of is that our administration, as quickly as possible, by mid-April, laid out a framework to open up America again. And I'm proud of the Republican governors that stepped forward. Governor Brian Kemp, who I mentioned before, was the first governor in America to open up. Governor Ron DeSantis quickly thereafter. Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona opened their states up, made sure their schools opened up. But I was very disappointed when many Democrats around the country, for reasons that were inexplicable to me, that continued to enforce the kind of lockdowns on their economy and their schools that was unjustifiable. You know, it's largely lost in the public debate. Our administration never said that schools should be closed. In fact, I remember gathering at the Department of Education with Secretary Betsy DeVos in the summer of 2020 just for the sole purpose of having all our health experts look into your cameras and say, open the schools up. We can safely get our kids back in the classroom. And the recent education report cards that have come out prove the fact that we've paid a very dear price for the states that shut down their schools longer than had ever been necessary.
There's a lot of topics I want to get to, but I want to ask you one thing on abortion. You support a national ban. You're very happy on this. I mean, am I right? Would you like to see a federal ban on abortion?
You know, I write about my commitment to the sanctity of life, and so help me God, at great length. And I must tell you, and you having written a book, know that you hit deadlines and you don't always get everything in you want. Yeah. And I have to tell you, it was such a joy for me when I was putting the finishing touches on this book to actually be able to reflect on the fact that after 49 years, with 3 Supreme Court justices appointed in our administration, we gave the American people a new beginning for life. The Dobbs decision not just overturned Roe v. Wade, but it returned the question of abortion to the states and to the American people. And I celebrate that from really the depths of my heart. You know, when I was a young man, the most important decision I ever made was when I put my faith in Jesus Christ. I opened up the Bible, I read verses like, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And I set before you life and death. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. I knew in that moment, a decade before I would arrive in Congress, that the cause of life had to be my cause. And I must tell you, Chuck, to have been able to champion life in the Congress and as governor, but to have been a part of an administration that gave the American people this new beginning for life is something I'll cherish the rest of my life.
Is that the most important achievement of that in your mind, of the administration?
I truly believe the opportunity to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law may be among the most consequential legacies of the Trump-Pence administration, if not the most consequential. But I would also say, with regard to your question, that when when Senator Graham introduced legislation to establish a 15-week ban on abortion, I thought it was useful. If I'd still been a member of Congress, I would have voted for it. It was useful in the sense of demonstrating that the Democrats' position is the extreme position. The Democratic Party today supports abortion on demand up to the moment of birth and taxpayer funding of abortion. But I recognize that this issue is likely going to be resolved one state at a time. Some states have already acted to advance the cause of life. And I've said to people, when the Dobbs decision was overturned, we haven't come to the end. We've come to the end of the beginning. Mm-hmm. And Chuck, it may take as many years to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law in every state in this country as it took to overturn Roe versus Wade. But as long as I have breath,
I know you've got passion. Are you a limited? You're a limited government guy. I know this. And you really are. Are you comfortable with the idea of essentially government-mandated pregnancy? If somebody doesn't want this child, doesn't want this pregnancy to go through, you're now advocating a law that essentially the government is ordering you to go through with this pregnancy. Are you comfortable with a government mandate like that? The folks in Kansas were not.
Our founding documents say we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And the first one mentioned is life. And I think government exists to protect life, particularly defenseless life. And I intend to be a part of this. But I think we have an opportunity, Chuck, to approach this debate in a new and in renewed way. You know, when the Supreme Court took this issue away from the American people 49 years ago, there were strong dividing lines that have endured now for 2 generations. But now we have a political debate. And we have the opportunity not just to craft thoughtful protections for the unborn, but also to extend protections and support for women in crisis pregnancy and for newborns. I'd like to see us redouble our efforts to demonstrate the compassion of the American people, to live out the idea that there is no unwanted child, and that in the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world, we can make that the reality.
Do you think the unborn have constitutional rights?
I believe
they don't in our law right now, but do you believe they should?
I believe in the right to life, and
do you believe an unborn fetus has a constitutional right?
We are protected in this country from being denied life or liberty without due process of law. And I believe those protections should extend to the born and the unborn. But this is a long-term cause. And it'll be as much moral persuasion in America as political debate.
Shouldn't that be where it is, though? Shouldn't it be moral persuasion and not government mandate?
I really do believe now that it's been returned to the political process, Chuck, that we have an incredible opportunity to demonstrate the real heart and compassion of the American people in this cause, to persuade our neighbors and friends to the day that abortion is not only illegal, but it's unthinkable. And when that day comes, then we'll someday institute in the laws of all 50 states.
There are a lot of women uncomfortable with the idea that a politician will make this decision for them.
I understand that. I do. But I really do believe that restoring the sanctity of life to the center of law in every state in this country is at the very heart of achieving a boundless future for the American people.
Mr. Vice President, appreciate the time. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Got it.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.